Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to introduce a couple different math functions and see how to use it in the BigQuery console. In line with our outline, we have already completed part 1 of the module, Mathematize Me Cap'n, and we are in part 2, and we're going to go over the different examples. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and open up our BigQuery browser and learn some new math functions. So I have a couple different examples for us to practice a few different math functions. We're going to keep the trip distance, total amount, and we are going to find the following. First, we are going to find the cost per mile. Whenever you hear the word per, this means that the first one is going to be divided by the second. So if you can imagine, what are my miles per gallon? How would you find that? You would find out how many miles did I drive divided by how many gallons did it take. And that would be your miles per gallon. So if we want to find cost per mile, we will just divide cost over mile. So we'll use an example doing cost over mile and then compare that using the safe divide function. Next, we'll practice some rounding, going to 2 decimal places. We're going to bring the total amount to the next dollar, bring the total amount to the previous dollar, and last, we'll find the difference between the tip and total amount, but make them always be positive numbers. We're going to filter our data for rows for vendor ID 1 on Christmas Eve. So let's get started just pulling in our columns and then filtering our rows. And then we'll get to the new stuff, which is all of this math. So we're going to do select from our taxi cab data. And like always, I forget what all of these columns are called. So let's keep trip distance. So let's look at distance in our filter. Trip distance, perfect. Trip underscore distance. And then we're going to take tip amount. And this is pre-filling for me, so I know that that's the right way to spell it. And total amount. And I want total amount up here. Total amount. Okay, great. So I have my 3 columns. I have my table, and I'm going to filter my data for rows for vendor ID equals 1 and only on dates for Christmas Eve. So to filter our data, we always use where vendor ID equals 1, and our date of our pickup, date time, equals 2014-12-24, and this needs to be covered in quotation marks. Okay, and we see this, and let's go ahead and just put on our limit, and let's take a look at our data. So these are all of the different trips that happened on Christmas Eve for vendor 1. Let's see, we have trip distance 6.2, total amount is 0, tip amount is 0. We're seeing some interesting numbers here. This might be bad data. I would assume that this taxi cab driver didn't actually give the ride away for free. Maybe this is how the data encapsulates cash. I don't know. Okay, so now we see this. We're feeling pretty good. Let's start to tackle these different tasks that we have for ourselves. So for the first thing we want to do is we want to find cost per mile. So cost per mile, our cost is going to be the total amount, and then the mile is going to be our trip distance. So if we divide our total amount 0 over 6.2, what will that give us? This might have broke your brain, and that's common. Whenever you're dividing by 0, it can get really dicey. If I'm dividing by 0 and 0's on the top, that's going to turn my whole fraction into 0. So if I want to know what was my cost per per mile, my cost was 0. Well, my cost per mile is also 0. It cost me nothing, therefore I paid nothing, therefore my cost per anything is going to be 0. Now what happens if our trip distance is 0? I paid a penny and I went nowhere. If you think about that, you might not have a good answer. And that's because in the math world, this is a big, big no-no. You're not allowed to divide by 0. Your 0, he's not allowed to be in the numerator. So if we have a 0 in the numerator, it's going to break our query. Let me show you. So we have our columns, and if I say, let's take our cost, total amount, divide by mile, our trip distance, and let's take off our limit, and I run it. Let's see what happens. Bam, I get an error. That's because we have a division by 0. And so what happened is that even though there were so many values that could have been divided, BigQuery saw, oh, there's a 0 in here. I don't know what to do with it, and I'm just going to abort the whole thing. It's a big problem. So one way we could get around this is we could say vendor ID equals 1, and our date is on Christmas Eve, and our trip distance does not equal 0. So you can be a negative, you can be a positive, you can be any number in between, but you just cannot be 0. So we could do that, and then we would do the not equal by doing our little greater than or equal than signs. And if you're not used to those, that is the period and the comma on your keyboard. So we do not equal to 0. So let's try that. Okay, so we have now our total amount, our trip distance, and then this column, I didn't rename it, whoopsies. This is our cost per mile, and we can see that works for us. And we'll call this as cost per mile. Now let's just say we said, you know what, we don't want to have to worry about the 0 thing, and maybe we want to keep other parts of an entry where the distance is 0. We don't want to just completely kill the whole row just because there happens to be a 0 in that particular column. BigQuery has something called safe divide. What safe divide does is it's the same thing as above, but if you hit a 0, it's going to say, don't worry about it, girl. We're just going to call that a null or a blank, and we're going to keep the program moving. So how safe divide works is you put your numerator or the top number in the first position, total amount, comma, your denominator or your bottom number. And that's going to be trip distance as cost per mile safe. So let's try this. With our cost per mile and our cost per mile safe, the numbers are exactly the same. And that's good. That's because the math that we're doing is exactly the same. There's no difference between this guy and this guy, as long as your denominator or that bottom number is not 0. They are exactly the same. But let's get rid of this condition. And let's see if our safe divide works if we allow our trip distance, if we allow some zeros in there. Let's see what happens. Voila, before we got an error. BigQuery completely crashed. But now, bam, works just like normal. Let's see what happens when the total or the trip distance is equal to 0. So let's say trip distance equals 0. What are we going to get? And I already told you before, but just to remind you, we're going to get just a missing. We're going to get a null. BigQuery says, you are not allowed to do this. This is a big math no-no, and I'm just going to say skip and go to the next one. So whenever you're doing any type of data work, you always want to do your safe divide instead of your regular divide. That way, if you get a 0 or something crazy, it's going to keep the program moving. So the next thing we're going to do is we want to round our cost per mile to 2 decimal places. Because when you think about it, we're talking about costs in dollars, and dollars only go down to the penny. We don't have something lower than a penny, so it really doesn't make sense to show that to anyone. So what we want to do is we want to round our cost per mile, safe, this guy. What we want to do is we want to say, go to the nearest penny, either up or down. So to do that, all we have to do, we'll type round, and we have our little parentheses. What are we going to round? We're going to round this guy. And we're just going to do handy dandy copy paste and stick them right in here. Bam. Now round wants to know, do you want to round to the dollar? Do you want to round to the penny? Do you want to round to the thousand? What do you want to round to? So we're going to round to the nearest penny. So we're going to round 2 decimal places. And we're going to call this as round CPM, cost per mile. So this is 0, 0. Okay, here's a good one. So here we have the cost per mile as $3.24 and this big thing. So instead of showing this whole crazy number, which hurts your eyes, we're just going to make it $3.25. And that's something that feels really good for people to look at. Let's see if we can find one that goes down. Here's one. So here's $3.53 and this chunk here. Well, this guy down here, he starts at a 4, and since that's our cutoff, either you're a 4 or 5, and he happens to be a 4, he's going to go down. So he gets rounded down to $3.53. So that's how round works. It's a nice formatting tool because you don't want to look at all of this. Sometimes it can hurt your brain. Sometimes it doesn't make sense for your analysis. So round is something that can really come in handy. We're going to try something similar. We are going to bring our total amount to the next dollar, and then we'll bring our total amount to the previous dollar. This might sound a lot like the rounding we just did, but it's a little different. So let's take a look. So if we were to take this guy and we bring him to the next dollar, we say, your total amount is $43.20, but I'm going to the next dollar regardless if it's a penny or a dime or a quarter. So he would get turned to 44. In the opposite direction, I might say, I don't care if he's 36.5 or 36.9999999. I want him to go down to the previous number. So to do that, we can do the floor or the ceiling. And based on my descriptions, you might already have a good idea of what does what. So if we do the CEIL or the ceiling of total amount as CEIL total and floor total amount as floor total. Floor, he's going to bring you down to the floor. So he's going to say, I don't care how many cents you have after that dollar, you're going down. Likewise, CEIL says, I don't care how many cents you have, you're going up. So let's try it. Okay, so let's see. So our total amount, the devil's number, $66.60. If we do our CEIL, he goes up to $67. If we do our floor, he goes down to $66. Let's find another one. Here's one. $43, he goes up to $44 with the CEIL. $43.20, he goes down to $43 with the floor. And the round does our normal rounding rules with the 0.5, 0.4. So it's a little bit different. You might say, why would you ever want to do that? Well, typically you want to use the ceiling or the floor when you're working with data that can't be a fraction. So if you could imagine, maybe I'm an airline and I need to figure out how many seats I can fit with the number of people that I have. And I did some kind of average, I did all this math, and it came out with 2.5 people. I can't have half a person. So an airline might say, I'm going to go up to the next seat to make sure that I'm not going to have someone without a seat on the plane. even if that means that I kind of overdid it and I maybe have a missing seat or two. So your Delta, they might do that. Your Spirit or your budget airline might say, listen, we are here to give people low costs. We cannot be having any missing seats on this plane. So if we have 2.5 people, I don't care. You are going down. We're going to say there's only 2 seats, and that whoever that half a person is, they show up late, they get bumped to the next flight. So typically you want to use the ceiling or the floor if you're working with data that can only be a whole number. Okay, last thing we want to do is we want to find the difference between the tip and total amount, but make them positive numbers. So in general, we can assume that your tip, how much you give extra, is always going to be less than your total. And let's just say our manager wasn't very good at math and they said, find me the difference between the tip amount and the total amount. And you were being very literal and you said, okay, fine. If I do tip amount minus total amount as difference, I'm going to get negative dollars. That might not make sense for your analysis to have negative dollars. And you say, that negative $17, no, I don't want that. I want all of these to be positive numbers. So to do that, you can do what's called the absolute value. And we abbreviate that ABS. And we're just going to put him in here. And so what he's going to do is he's going to say, I don't care that tip amount minus total amount is negative. He's going to be positive no matter what. So let's take a look. Okay, here you go. So you see in our regular difference, it's going to be negative $17. But with our absolute, he gets flipped. And he says, you're going to be positive. And that happens for all of our numbers. Now your question might be, what happens if you have a positive number? Well, absolute says we want everybody to be positive. So if you're already positive, you're good to go. It's only the negatives that we're impacting. Now that we've gone through these examples, let's jump back to the PowerPoint and wrap up this lesson. In this lesson, we learned 5 different math functions: safe divide, round, ceiling or CEIL, floor, and absolute, which is abbreviated ABS. In our next lesson, we're going to use all of this information that we have, summarize it into a nice tool belt for you to keep as part of your data coding notes. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, I would be so appreciative if you could like the video and subscribe to help me create more content for you. Thank you.